Hello, everybody. My name is Dan Dunsky. I'm the executive producer of The Agenda with Steve Paikin, and I'm joined today by Janice Stein, the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and TVO's own foreign affairs analyst, to discuss ISIL, ISIS. Hello, Janice.
Good afternoon to you, Dan.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good, good. Well, let's get right into it. Last Wednesday, so just over a week ago, President Obama addressed the nation and he laid out the case for military action. I know that people aren't calling it a war just yet, but we can get to that a little later. Military action in a coalition against ISIS, ISIL, IS, whatever the term of art you prefer is. And he did so by saying that ISIS was a threat to American national interests. There's no question that ISIS is brutal, but what's the specific threat to American national interests?
You know, you're asking a very important question, Dan, because when you take apart what that threat is, there, to the best of our knowledge, there was not last week, and this changes, but there was not hard intelligence evidence that there was any plan to attack the United States directly, nor in fact to attack any of the allies of the United States. So when he said a threat to national interest, I think we're talking about something longer term. We are talking about a threat to the allies of the United States, principally Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The monarchs in both those countries have been pushing the president very, very hard because the Islamic State, which claims to be the only true Islamic state in the region, effectively is saying to the Saudis, you are imposters, and to the United Arab Emirates, you are imposters. So it's in that sense that Barack Obama was talking about it, not in the sense of an immediate attack. Now, there was an incident, to the best of my knowledge, this morning in Australia, where for the first time we see somebody who claims to be a member of the Islamic State intending to carry out an act of violence and terror on the soil of a Western country. So, you know, what do we draw from that? What I think is fair to say to our listeners and our viewers is that the Islamic State is not focused principally on acts of terror against the West in the way that Al-Qaeda was. It is far more focused inwardly on building a state and on attacking the legitimacy of other Islamic governments.
Okay, so let's just break. We're going to get to the question of whether or not the strategy that Obama outlined is sufficient to address the threat that he outlined. But just before that, let me pick up on some of the things that you've said. So you mentioned Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Broadly speaking, even if there is no direct threat to the United States homeland, is a threat to an ally sufficient to be considered a national interest threat that would justify this kind of response?
Well, you know, we have an obvious answer to that question when we talk about NATO allies. So for the 27-member NATO alliance, any threat to one is a threat to all. And we just invoke Article 5, which has only been invoked once, actually, after 9/11.
Right.
And so a threat to allies is a direct threat to the national interest. That does not apply to any state in the Middle East. Nevertheless, there is a very long relationship between Saudi Arabia and the United States. In fact, a relationship that has been very troubled over the last decade, which with the emergence of the Islamic State, the cracks are now ironically, beginning to be repaired, because Saudi Arabia has been a leading exporter and funder of some of the thinking and the action that lies behind ISIS.
Okay, let me interrupt you there. Take a couple of seconds and explain to our viewers exactly what you mean by that.
So the Saudi government, which is really a conjoining over its history over the last 100 years of two trends. One is the Al Saud ruling family which generations have succeeded one another, and it passes amongst brothers who become kings, were joined with an older tradition in the Arabian Peninsula, the Wahhabi tradition of Islam, which was the most literalist interpretation, the most purist interpretation of Islam in the region. And over the years, the Saudi charities, Saudi individuals have funded the organizations throughout the Middle East which claim to be pure, which are Salafist, which is the word we use for a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam. And I think it's been a very carefully orchestrated strategy, the argument being that if you fund other organizations that operate beyond your own borders, you keep your internal politics safe.
So the point is that Saudi Arabia, as part of the deal, the royal family ensures that there remains a relative degree of calm at home by exporting Wahhabism abroad?
That's right. That's right. And that's been the pattern for 40 years, really. It seems this time, and Saudi Arabia and the United States have had a difficult decade, largely because, as we know, the bombers on the airplanes on 9/11 were principally Saudi.
15 of the 19 were Saudi.
15 of the 19 were Saudi. Al-Qaeda was a creation of Saudis and Egyptians in exile. So there's the proof of what we've been talking about. And President George Bush turned against and was deeply critical of the Saudis, and essentially said to them, that's no longer an acceptable strategy.
So let me just, so coming back to the initial point about national interests, despite everything that you're just laying out, the United States still has a compelling national interest in remaining allied with Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think the answer is yes, despite this deep division. And the answer is yes, because the United States will be energy self-sufficient in the next 10 years, but its European allies will not. Japan will not. So the closest friends and allies, with the exception of Canada, of the United States, will still depend to some degree on oil that flows through the Gulf.
I see. So the compelling national interest is to ensure the continued flow of oil to world markets, which underpins the global trade on a global scale, is still a compelling national interest.
It underpins global trade, it underpins global manufacturing, it underpins a stable global financial system, and is the remaining superpower, the status quo manager of the world system. Not as strong as it was, but nevertheless still by far the strongest. That is the compelling interest.
And we should point out that I think that despite the growth of energy resources in the United States, in Canada, and elsewhere, Saudi Arabia still remains, I think, the only country that can affect the price of oil by ramping up production quickly. Is that correct?
That's right, because it's easiest for the Saudis to increase the amount of oil that they supply to world markets, and they've played that role over the last, and very, very effectively. At times when either Iraq or Iran have wanted to increase the price of oil, the Saudis have driven it down by increasing production. And that's the crucial context to what you see happening now. Now, this is a moment, though, where, and here I think President Obama is not doing all that he should, because there is a moment to say to the Saudis, this is the second time in slightly more than a decade that you've created a monster. And so something has to change about the oversight of Saudi charities, which are able to export money virtually unregulated by the Saudi government. The Saudi government, for the reasons we just talked about, turns a blind eye. And yet that is the principal source of funds that flow to these organizations. Now, ISIS, just for viewers, is important. They are no longer dependent on Saudi funds because since they've been able to capture territory, they have 60 oil wells. They're exporting oil through Turkey, $3 million a day. They have a population that they tax, they kidnap, and they extort ransom. So that dependence on Saudi money and finance is gone, but it was crucial in the early stages.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a little bit, and especially about Turkey and Saudi Arabia's role in President Obama's strategy. I want to ask you one more question about national interests in the region. Is it a compelling national interest to say that destabilization in the Middle East, as a general principle, that ISIS is creating too much uncertainty in the Middle East? Now, you've mentioned Saudi Arabia and you've mentioned the UAE. I'm assuming that Jordan, Turkey, the threat that Iran can get dragged into what is to what could have very significant sectarian to a fight that has significant sectarian tendencies. Is it sufficient to say that too, or is it okay to say that too presents a compelling national security interest?
So then you've just stated the maximalist view threat of ISIS. So there is a minimalist view too, and let's put it out there. And again, when you're estimating a threat, it's a future-oriented activity. So none of us can be sure, but there's a more minimalist view, which says really that the Islamic State has succeeded only in territory where former Sunni majorities are now minorities and feel oppressed by Shia governments. So that is the story in Iraq. It is in central Iraq, the Sunni belt. They ruled even though they were 20% of the population. They were displaced finally by the Shia majority. And now the Islamic State has succeeded, built on the grievances of the Sunni minority that was badly treated by the Shia majority in the last 3 years, but nothing compared to what they themselves did to the Shias over the years. And on the Syrian side, they are gaining support from a Sunni population that has been ruled by an Alawite family, which controls 15% of the population. That is where Islamic State has established itself. That's not true in Jordan at all. That's not true in Saudi Arabia. That's not true in the Emirates. It's actually true nowhere else. So there is an argument that the Islamic State will have difficulty expanding beyond the confines of the territory it now holds. Now, will it be a magnet for young men, discontented, who will join, in a sense, in the holy exercise? Yes. And we see thousands. ISIS has grown in 2 years from 1,500 fighters to between 20 and 30,000 fighters. That's not all Sunni Iraqis and Sunni Syrians. So it isn't, and so that's a problem, and that's a threat. But to think about the Islamic State sweeping the whole of the Middle East, I don't think that's likely.
Okay, so that's very interesting. What you're essentially saying is that they have limited upside growth potential.
Correct.
And if that's the case, now let's talk about the desired outcome that President Obama spoke of last Wednesday. He talked about, quote, to degrading and destroying ISIS. First of all, tell us what you understand that to mean. Well, and then I'll come back and follow up with something that you just made me think about.
So I think it's easier to explain what he means by degrade. And we would use the expression contain, which is a long-standing verb that we've used in the West. It goes back to the Cold War and George F. Kennan. But he was very careful because he said, you can't destroy the Soviet Union, so we need to contain it. Obama did not say that. He said degrade and destroy. But the degrade strategy means limit the capacity to export oil through Turkey. Limit the capacity of fighters to attack the Kurdish areas, for instance, which they were on the verge of when the Iraqi Kurdish fighters, the Peshmergas, really collapsed because they had not fought in battle for over 10 years. Limit the capacity to launch any offensive south of Baghdad. These are all versions. Limit the financing that flows in from the charities that I've talked about. Don't pay ransom for kidnappers, which is something that the United States is probably the only country in the world that is not doing. Every other country is paying ransom. So there's a series of strategies to contain and eventually, over time, hope that the size of the Islamic State will shrink as Sunni tribal leaders that made an alliance of convenience turn against the brutality of those who are currently ruling through terror, beheading opponents, keeping women at home, not allowing
the whole litany, the whole range of it.
The whole range.
And there's a precedent for that, because that, of course, is what happened during the awakening in 2006, 2007 in Iraq.
Exactly, and the awakening, just for viewers, refers to a period when the United States cooperated with Sunni tribal leaders and were able to defeat Al-Qaeda, but promised them, these same leaders, we're talking about the same leaders, promised them that they would be treated fairly, that they would be given jobs in the Shia army, and that they would be appropriately represented in the governing structures. As soon as the United States withdrew, the then Prime Minister of Iraq, al-Maliki, broke every single one of these promises. So it's going to be harder now done than it was 7 years ago to persuade these very same people or their sons that any commitments that are made will actually be honored.
Okay, back to the strategy question. So it's interesting. You referred to degrade and destroy, and you focused on the word. You focused on that one as a strategy of containment.
Right.
And if as we said before, ISIL has a limited ability to grow, that would suggest that a containment strategy could well work. And then so essentially what you're doing is you're waiting. You're limiting its possibility, the possibility for it to expand. You're limiting the scope of damage that it could cause. And then you wait for what?
You wait for it to, and that's what the older strategy of containment was based on. You wait for it to collapse under its own contradictions. So you wait for the Sunni tribal leaders to become so repelled by the level of violence that is being inflicted on the population that they then split that coalition, which is allowing the Islamic State to function now.
And is that what you think President Obama means by destroy?
I don't know what he means by destroy. I don't believe that the United States can destroy the Islamic State. I don't believe that any outsiders can destroy. Now, short of a massive number of forces on the ground, of course you could. But if he at the same time as he said degrade and destroy, and he's repeated often since then, there will be no ground forces. We are not asking for ground forces. So there is no capacity, no matter what you do from the air, to destroy the Islamic State. And you can do a great deal of damage too, because we've seen this, and this is I would imagine a decision point right now, that if Western forces, and there will be some Arab states involved, but largely again Western forces, bomb from the air and there are civilian casualties, that more than anything is likely to push some of the expatriate fighters who are there on the ground to turn their attention in a serious way back to their former homes.
Okay, so you've described what the strategy is, and now the second part of it, of course, is putting together this broad coalition that President Obama spoke about last week, where he is looking primarily, if I could just summarize it, to Western powers to provide air support,
right,
and any so-called boots on the ground that should come from Arab countries themselves, and Turkey, he was hoping. How has that been going in the 8 days since he announced that strategy, finding that coalition?
So certainly he has widespread support in the West, and it's important to stop over that for a moment, because when President George Bush was attempting to build a coalition to invade Iraq, France, Germany, these were holdout countries in a very, very strong way. President Hollande of France now is leading the charge, frankly. So the split in Europe that took place a decade ago is gone, and they are unified behind the American president, and that's not an inconsiderable achievement.
That's not nothing.
That's not nothing, right? In the Middle East, he has the support of Saudi Arabia. Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. None of those countries are going to put any forces on the ground. The Saudis and the United Emirates do not have forces to put on the ground, and Egypt is utterly preoccupied by the transition that it is going through right now, and it's inconceivable that the Egyptian army would deploy under those circumstances. So there are no boots on the ground. Turkey, which is absolutely key in this story because the Islamic State is exporting its oil through Turkey. That's really the only outlet it has, and it reflags its oil because it doesn't get exported as Islamic State oil. But the Turks are extremely reluctant. First of all, for an immediate reason, there are 49 hostages that are being held. And
Turkish hostages.
Turkish hostages that are being held by Islamic State. And President Erdogan, I don't think, would look forward to having any of those hostages beheaded in videos that would set Turkish public opinion on fire in the same way that the 3 videos have set British and American public opinion on fire. So he's been very, very reserved about making any kind of commitment, even to restraining the export of oil. Now,
okay, explain that to me. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I don't understand. That would seem to me to be a fairly simple thing to do. You're not indicating any aggressive intent. You're not joining in an air campaign. You're certainly not putting any boots on the ground. You're a member of NATO. Why won't Erdogan take the steps needed to restrain the flow of oil, which, as you have pointed out, is one of the ways that ISIS raised the most amounts of its funds?
Absolutely, it's key, really, and it's certainly key. There's 2. Let me just add one more piece of information.
Okay.
When the Islamic State established itself in that month, where it effectively expanded and seized territory, it also seized central bank funds, Iraqi central bank funds, in several of the cities. So it has hundreds of millions of dollars now that it seized. That's important for now, but it's on a long-term basis for economic sustainability. You can only live off cash for so long, right? So it is the oil exports that are really critical. You're absolutely right. It's difficult to really explain Erdogan's decision. I think the hostages are a big factor. He's unwilling to make any move until those hostages are released, because he feels, I think, that even if he does this, al-Baghdadi will know nothing is secret, and they will start to kill Turkish hostages. So that's the big constraint. Secondly, the relationship between Obama and Erdogan also fractured over the last 2 years over a whole set of issues: Gaza, Syria, and in all these cases, by the way, Erdogan was critical of the President of the United States for not doing enough. Now the President of the United States is coming to them and saying, "You do something," and he feels less than motivated to do it under the circumstances.
All right, a few more questions. One,
It's
there's
not
also.
smart, though. It's not
No, I understand what you're saying. The president also has indicated now that he, and I think he just yesterday got approval from Congress to fund the so-called moderate rebels in Syria as part of this strategy against ISIS. 2 questions that follow from that is, why did this take so long? And is this going to be, is the moderate opposition in any way strong enough, and can it be made strong enough, even with the funds that the United States could provide, to form a decent opposition against ISIS?
So the moderate opposition is a chimera. It's a myth.
It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist, and that's partly why it took so long. And actually, there's a very vicious game going on right now in Syria. If you grant for the moment that there are 3 clusters of forces on the ground in Syria right now, one is the Islamic State, which has now seized and controlled territory in Syria, in the northwest part of the country. The other are a large collection of individual, militant groups who are fighting against the regime, and then there are the regime forces. These moderate forces are so-called in that middle group. What has Assad done in the last week? He has started to concentrate all his fire against those forces in the middle, while not attacking Islamic State forces at all, because they serve his interest, to the point that he can then present the West with a stark choice. It's me or the Islamic State, and I told you that the alternative to me would be the worst kind of terrorism. That actually works for him. So he has accelerated his attacks on the very groups that Congress authorized funding and help for. By the time that funding and help gets anywhere near these groups, they will have been obliterated by Assad's forces.
That's a vile game. Two more questions for you, Janice. So, given everything that we've just talked about, has Barack Obama, both last Wednesday and since then in the activities that have taken place, has he outlined, is this a strategy that is commensurate with the threat that is IS?
If I take the first half of a sentence, if I take the sentence, we will degrade the Islamic State. That is, I think, the only strategy that's available to him. It's a strategy of military containment. That's what he's talking about now, with very, very limited boots on the ground. These are special operations force, and the numbers are really small when you think about how many American forces deployed in Iraq. It's small, 1,500 versus 150,000. There's a very, very big difference. It's financial containment. It will have to focus on the export of oil. So if he's clear on that, really what he's talking about is a containment strategy. That is the best strategy on offer right now, and it won't be over in a month, and it won't be over in a year, and it may not even be over in 3 years. He's quite right. It will be the next president's problem as well as his. If he's talking about destroying, then that is unrealistic.
Other than in the way that you described, which is destruction over long time under the weight of its own contradictions.
Correct. Correct.
Final question is, what then should we be looking for to see in the medium term whether to be able to gauge the success of this strategy?
So the first thing I think is we want to see whether ISIS is able at all to expand its territory. It seems to have been stopped cold a month ago when the United States finally intervened with airstrikes. That's the first thing. The second thing I think is worthwhile looking at very carefully is how effective the Peshmergas become. Is American assistance, military assistance, advisors, we are sending assistance to the Kurds in Canada. Are the Kurds effectively able to increase their fighting capability and serve as a barrier, as a firewall to any further advances by the Islamic State? Those are very important near-term objectives and near-term monitors that we can look at. Thirdly, can Obama persuade Erdogan and others, buyers and sellers, to stop buying oil from the Islamic State? Because if you cut off revenue, that is the beginning of cutting off the oxygen supply. And then I think we can have confidence that the strategy has a good chance of working.
That's Janice Stein, the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and TVO's Foreign Affairs Analyst. Thanks very much, Janice.
Always a pleasure.
And we look forward to seeing you back here soon and, as always, on the broadcast. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.